Ah, Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today, I thought I would continue my exploration of the genre of horror fiction. This is a very new genre to me. It is the inspiration of a fellow booktuber, so I'm really excited to be starting to read and have some adventure into the horror as a genre and to see where it possibly takes me. And I'm now really excited to share some of my thoughts with you on this new genre. What I thought I would look at today is continuing my adventure with Shirley Jackson. I'm going to today look at Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. And this is the wonderful copy of it that I have. This is the first paragraph of this remarkably powerful and evocative novel. Just the first paragraph. Listen to this. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. It's such a richly dramatic and evocative writing style, isn't it? I'm really beginning to enjoy Shirley Jackson. This is the beginning of chapter 2, another dozen or so pages further into the story. This is the first page of chapter 2, when our little group of characters, our actors, start to assemble at the beginning of the novel at Hill House. The beginning of chapter 2. No human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place, which suggests evil in the face of a house. And yet somehow a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky, turned Hill House into a place of despair. More frightening because the face of Hill House seemed awake with a watchfulness from the blank windows and a touch of glee in the eyebrow of a cornice. Almost any house caught unexpectedly or at an odd angle can turn a deeply humorous look on a watching person. Even a mischievous little chimney or a dormer like a dimple can catch up a beholder with a sense of fellowship. But a house arrogant and hating, never off guard, can only be evil. This house, which seems somehow to have formed itself, flying together into its own powerful pattern under the hands of its builders, fitting itself into its own construction without concession to humanity. It was a house without kindness, never meant to be lived in, not a fit place for people or for love or for hope. Exorcism cannot alter the countenance of a house. Hill House would stay as it was until it was destroyed. I should have turned back at the gate Eleanor thought. The house had caught her with an atavistic turn in the pit of her stomach, and she looked along the lines of its roof, fruitlessly endeavouring to locate the badness. Whatever dwelt there, her hands turned nervously cold, so that she fumbled, trying to take out a cigarette, and beyond everything else, she was afraid, listening to the sick voice inside her, which whispered, "Get away from here. Get away." Oh, the language is just so richly dramatic and evocative. It's a beautiful opening to this quite remarkable novel. It's interesting, isn't it, with horror? You know, what is its charism? What is its purpose? I guess in many regards, horror may be one of the closest experiences I'm ever going to have to reading popular fiction. You know, and all of this discussion about highbrow and lowbrow, you know, I think we've moved beyond those sorts of discussions now, haven't we? So what is horror? You know, what is its purpose? It's interesting. For me, it's very interesting, coming from my background of that, you know, really strict evangelical, you know, naive, idealistic Christian Protestant home. I think one of the reasons why I've never watched horror, I've never read horror, is because of that Christian background, and that maybe fear is the wrong word, but our anxieties, our uncertainty that I guess had drilled into me about dabbling with anything to do with the occult, with Satan, you know, the dark sides. And I guess without even thinking about it, as I've sort of moved away from that Protestant Christian upbringing, I've maintained some of those interesting hangers-on, I guess. I guess that's one of the reasons why I've never read horror or watched it on television. An interesting thing happened to me about 10 years ago. I've done a video on this before called First Australian Royalty, when I went and lived for, you know, it was my lifelong goal, the biggest thing I ever wanted to do in my life. Once my children left home and became adults, my big life goal was to go to really remote Aboriginal Australia, First Australian country, and to live on country with people, and to experience, you know, to be welcomed into family and culture, to be educated and shown how to live as an Australian on this country. It was one of my great dreams, and I eventually, in 2010, had that opportunity, and I lived for 5 years up in the Gulf of Carpentaria, with particularly the Gudangji and the Yanyula, the Mala and the Galawa people. But in particular for me, I was really welcomed into family and culture, in particular by the Gudangji mob. And I had permission and the respect of the elders to write about my experiences with them, where I was running, you know, big sport and outdoor education camping programs. I went to the Gulf of Carpentaria, not an atheist, certainly not an atheist. Atheism is a pipe dream too far for me. But I think I went to the Gulf of Carpentaria, certainly, probably would describing myself as a Christian agnostic. And I think, even though I still believed in God, for me, God had become very much, I think, a very naturalistic type of thing. I guess I was the closest I could come to explaining what I maybe believed in back then was pantheism. You know, God is nature and nature is God. And I think I had stopped believing in anything to do with the supernatural or with the miraculous. You know, I didn't believe in miracles at all by the time I got to the Gulf of Carpentaria in 2010. And being welcomed into family and culture, being taken out bush and told stories, and, you know, being sung into country, being introduced to really important sacred sites like, you know, like the dreaming of the devil and all of these sorts of spirits, you know. I learnt so much. And while I maybe went to the Gulf of Carpentaria, a Christian agnostic whose faith, if it was faith, was a very naturalistic faith. I didn't really believe in anything supernatural or miraculous at all. But being welcomed into family and culture and being taken and sung into country, you very quickly realized that the veil between this world and the other world is very thin. Part of being welcomed and embracing culture of the first Australians that I spent those 5 years with was to be reawakened again into a supernatural, a spiritual dimension, something completely different. And for me, it was an amazing baptism into a completely different way of walking and being in the world again. It took me right back to my childhood in that Christian Protestant evangelical home. It was a really interesting experience for me, quite disorientating, but it was a disorientation that I really appreciated and I think I needed. I got a lot of healing, a lot of redemption from living with those first Australian people for those 5 years. So for me, again, approaching horror is one of the purposes of horror is to peer beyond the veil, to peel back the veil separating our world from possible other worlds and to see what might be there. Is that one of the purposes of horror as a genre? Because it's interesting, isn't it? Shirley Jackson, she was married to a well-known United States book reviewer, and his whole thing was to set criticism, a critical culture, on completely scientific and completely materialistic grounds. Her husband Stanley, he wanted if you like, a science almost, a science of criticism, of review writing that would be based completely on a materialist ground. And Shirley Jackson at least said that she went along with that she really embraced Stanley's, her husband's, if you like, foundation for establishing this critical culture on scientific materialist grounds. So it was really interesting that when she turned to writing, and she had begun her adventure as a creative writer of ghost stories and horror stories before she even met Stanley. In matter of fact, in the biography that I reviewed a couple of videos ago, in that review, Ruth Franklin talks about the fact that Stanley actually fell in love with Shirley before he even met her. He fell in love with her through her writing. He discovered in a university publication some short stories that Shirley Jackson had written before they'd even met, and he just fell in love, and he announced to everyone that he was going to marry whoever it was that had written these stories. It's really interesting. So, was Shirley Jackson peeling back the veil, trying to explore through the genre of horror the supernatural, the world of the miraculous, It's interesting because she said at least that she didn't really quite believe in that. She had a very materialist way of experiencing and being in the world. Mind you, she also said, on the other hand, that she dabbled in witchcraft and that she was, used to performing witchcraft to secure wins for her favourite baseball team and to carry out other actions in the world. So Shirley Jackson had a really interesting take on all of these things. At the beginning of this novel, we have this little group of actors, because it is a very dramatic book. I haven't seen the film or TV show series of this novel, and I will watch that at some stage, I think, because the novel itself is very dramatic. So I really do see there's this small little group of characters that occupy the novel's centre of attention. And I really do like to see them as being like actors on a stage. That is really the sort of atmosphere that Shirley Jackson creates, because the novel is very small. It takes place in a very small place. Nearly the whole novel happens in just a few rooms within Hill House. And right at the beginning of the novel, one of the characters, Dr. Montague, he just tries to describe what it is, why he's assembled this small group of actors together and what it is that they are trying to do. And he says to all of them, to Luke, to Eleanor, to Theodora, he says to them that our purpose here is scientific and exploratory in nature. And he says that he has some theories around psychic phenomena, and he wants to test these theories. And it's really interesting because he's not a medical doctor. He's a doctor of philosophy. With a background in anthropology, apparently. So he is really interested in the occult, in the supernatural and the natural, and peering back the veil between them. And he's come to Hill House because it is this famous haunted house. And he assembles this small group of actors who are going to, strut and fret their stuff upon the stage of Hill House for a week or two and see what can be seen. The doctor also says to the other little small group of actors that Hill House is disturbed, it's leprous and sick, it is unfit for habitation, it is a dangerous place. And he reminds the others, Luke, Eleanor and Theodora, he reminds them that Hill House has a long tradition of having these nightly visitations, these mad visitations that have literally drove all previous occupants out of the house and away. So it's not a place that is considered to be fit for decent habitation. And that's what they're here to test. That's what Dr. Montague, Luke, Theodora and Eleanor have assembled to live in their house for 1 or 2 weeks, to live with one another and to see what can be seen, to test these psychic manifestations. It's such an interesting idea for a novel. I think Shirley Jackson was just amazing. The doctor also tells the little group of actors that every angle in Hill House is slightly wrong, and the stairs even are not quite level. Hill House is this gorgeous, ramshackling old mansion of a place, 80-year-old, a wooden house of double stories with towers and turrets, and it's a house, a mansion of a house, where apparently there is not one right angle. Every angle is slightly off, and even the beautiful staircase, the spiraling staircase in the center of the thing, it's not quite level. All the measurements are based on tiny aberrations. And the house itself is described as being musty and close, like the doorway to a tomb, and it has these notorious drafty cold spots. One of the most sinister cold spots is on the floor just outside the entrance to the nursery. The place in the heart of the house that should be the place of greatest succor, of nurture, of love and redemption. The entrance to the nursery has the greatest spot of this sinister coldness, this sense of foreboding and dread. And Eleanor says, after she's been living in the house for a couple of days, Eleanor, who's in a sense the main actor who holds this whole novel together, she's a young woman who's been brought into the house by Dr. Montague for the purposes of carrying out these scientific exploratory investigations. And Eleanor says very early on that the house makes her feel like she is a small creature being swallowed whole. Wow. This, in many ways, the little small group of actors, Dr. Montague, Luke, Eleanor, Theodora, Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper and cook, in many ways, the characters themselves are sort of more types than they are real people. And it's really interesting what Shirley Jackson is doing with this. They're not really well drawn, for my liking anyway, well drawn people with inner psychology and thoughts and feelings. They are, in a sense, types. And the biggest persona in the novel is the character of Hill House itself. Hill House is a character in the book. The way Shirley Jackson evokes and describes Hill House, the way she brings it to life with this sinister presence, this foreboding presence of this sulking monster that literally can swallow you whole. It's a remarkable achievement. And at one point, at the end of the novel, it is described as Hill House was dancing and it had a mad midnight fling with mad manifestations or evil, wicked manifestations taking place. It's a really interesting house, and Shirley Jackson, the way she describes Hill House and the way she so convincingly evokes it as this live presence. It's the house itself that is haunted. It doesn't only contain some presences, some manifestations. The house itself is evil, wicked, has this sense of dread to it. It's almost built into the architecture. But it's really interesting. As I said, in many ways, this novel, the greatest presence in the novel is the house itself by a country mile. As I just said before, the small cast of characters that the novel centres around, they are all in a sense types. So Dr. Montague, this PhD in anthropology, he's always described as being serious. He can shiver and grimace, but he is always serious, measuring, taking notes. And he's brave, of course. He's the one who can go outside and track an apparition in the dark, while the women inside, these young 20, 30-year-old women are inside in bed, clinging to one another in sisterly repose, like enchanted princesses. The characters are types. And I really think it's interesting the way Shirley Jackson uses gender. The doctor, as I just said, the doctor is constantly interpreting, defining, explaining, while the two young women, they sit cross-legged on the floor and giggle or play tic-tac-toe. They're almost infantile. What is Shirley Jackson doing with this? To some extent, of course, she's a mid-20th century writer, and she was quite young as well, because she was only 48 when she passed away. So to some extent, you've got to read the novel back in its period. It is an example of a mid-20th century novel. But what is Shirley Jackson doing with gender? It's really interesting. Is this sense that this novel is just slightly askew, that everything is not quite right? Nothing is quite as it appears to be. And is that what Shirley Jackson's also doing with gender? That she's deliberately playing with these types. The male as the active measurer, interpreter, explainer. It's the male who's in power. Montague is always referred to as the doctor, never by a Christian name, for example, his first name. And the women, as I said, the women are so passive. They're so almost very infantile. It's very, very interesting what she's doing. It really is like she's using gender itself as part of this sickness in the novel. For example, there's one moment in the novel where they're outside the nursery door. And as I said, that is the place, the site of the greatest sinister presence. And while the young man, Luke, who's there to help out, while the young man Luke is helping Dr. Montague with measurements and with the taking of notes, the recording of details, trying to measure the shape and size of this cold spot outside the nursery, and they've got thermometers and they're, again, measurements and recording, and everything's going on in a type of scientific methodology. But while the men are doing that, the two young women in their 20s and young 30s, the two young women are literally sitting on the floor, giggling with a type of nervous, anxious, they're sort of overwhelmed by the experience all the time. There's one time at night when this manifestation takes place, whether it's a type of ghostly hound or wolf, we're not really sure. But there's this one time when this presence, this manifestation takes place in the middle of the night, and the two men, Dr. Montague and Luke, of course, race outside and they track it outside to try and see exactly what it is. Again, because they're wanting to record and measure and take notes about everything that happens during the 2-week period in which they inhabit this house. And while the two men are active, going outside, the women, believe it or not, Shirley Jackson has the two young women clinging to one another in bed in sisterly embrace like enchanted princesses, waiting to be rescued again by Luke and by Dr. Montague when they return to the house. It's startling. It's really interesting what this novel does with gender, how it uses and interprets gender. It's almost like gender itself is part of the sickness of the house. As I said, I am very new to the genre of horror, so I don't know whether some of these representations of gender are tropes that go through many horror stories, particularly going back, of course, to the 19th century with Dracula and Frankenstein and these sorts of things. I'm going to be really interested to explore this as I keep going. This is a remarkable novel. In many ways, I've been told also in the biography I read by Ruth Franklin, in many ways, The Haunting of Hill House is a wildly, very personal appropriation, if you like, a take on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. And The Turn of the Screw will be my next video. So my next video will be on The Turn of the Screw as I follow this adventure with the genre of horror. And just holding these two books in my hands, there's another thing which was really taken me with these books anyway. I'm a poet, so I love compression. For me, give me Heart of Darkness any day over a Thackeray or a Dickens or anything like that. I really like compression and what that forces the writer to do in terms of atmosphere, mood and character. It seems to me that compression often really facilitates a slightly different approach to how a writer evokes mood and atmosphere particularly. And that's something which is really interesting as I start to explore this genre of horror. You can see from these books that they're not long novels at all. The Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, which is such a fabulous title, isn't it? The Turn of the Screw, wow. So many resonances and so much, pun value there. But it's only 150 pages long. This classic of American, early American Gothic. It's about 150 pages long. The Haunting of Hill House itself is only 200 pages long. So then really not much more than novellas. And this sense of compression that James and Jackson use, I think is, again, particularly for my ear, it's part of the majesty of the genre. It's one of the things that's really drawing me to it. So I'm really looking forward to continuing my adventure with horror and trying to work out what it is that this genre is on about. What is it doing? Is it just a type of popular fiction? Is it just money making? Because, it does have at least the potential for many more readers and for movie rights and all that sort of thing. So, what is the relationship between horror and lowbrow popular mediums and income, money? To what extent is horror about this peering through the other side, trying to work out the gaps, the differences between the natural and the supernatural, the material and the spiritual? To what extent is horror a type of thinking theologically out loud, trying to work out our place in the world and our place in other worlds? I'm really curious to be continuing to explore this adventure with horror and trying to work out what it is that this genre is based on. What is it trying to do? But this video was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I had a ball reading this book and I had a great time thinking about it for this video. So my next video will be on Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. And this one, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Thank you and bye for now.